It's
Well,
too
thank
much
you
of a
for doing
close.
this. I've been watching. I mean,
Sure.
you've been doing more political work than me at this point. So
Well, I try
I
to. Well, you know, I'm getting back into doing stand up again, which I really haven't done full time in a while.
wait,
So
what? Wait a second. Like
yeah,
you're doing open
no,
mics?
I'm going up Saturday night. I'm gonna start working on a new hour. Yeah, so I'm starting to form. You know, when you do that type of thing, you got to form. Well, what am I even talking about? So that's where I am right now, forming that kind of thesis. So it should be fun. It's a little scary, Audie. Don't get me wrong,
I can
but it's fun. I
imagine. What
haven't.
do you think is pulling at your chest here?
It's you know what? I feel like I have to say something. I can't stay silent anymore about just the world that I'm in. You know, I've been wanting to observe for a while and just just take everything in. But I feel like, I've always considered myself, I call it a passionate centrist, which it's not really a political term. It's really just I want to make up my own mind by looking at the facts. Really, is what it is. You know, I hate being in a tribe, and I think tribalism is just it just kills me right now, especially in our politics. You know, it shows up in so many ways. So I'm kind of, from a political standpoint, kind of coming from that point of view, but it really is just trying to make sense out of a world that you know seems to make less sense every day. I guess that's the way to put it.
I think that's why I wanted to talk to you, uh, because I'm hearing so much anecdotally in think pieces about the rightward shift of X. And we talked to W. Kamau Bell about the rightward shift in comedy. But there was, to me, also, as big corporations who run studios or streaming networks or whoever, as we start to see how and where they spend their money, it feels like you can also feel a shift there too. And I was like, who do I know who's been through the ups and downs, you know what I mean, of niche programming,
Sure.
and would have the long view? Because I'm just not one of these people that's like, Yellowstone, that means it's red state TV now. You know, I'm kind of like, well,
Sure.
these things are cyclical. Every few years, there's television that leans one way or another
Thousand
way.
percent. Yeah.
But I still want to make sense of it. So, do you want to come along? Are you the
Sure.
right person?
Hopefully I can help you make sense. I mean, we're all throwing darts at the dartboard anyway. Who knows what the real thing is, you know?
All right. So, first of all, when you consider what I think experts call cultural polarization
Hmm.
and our entertainment, the literal version is sort of like red state entertainment and blue state entertainment. In
Mhm.
your mind, what's in those buckets?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I'm kind of a historian in some of this too. So sometimes I take an academic approach to it. So I apologize if some of it sounds a little
No,
dry.
that's literally why I
But,
called you.
okay. But because I have loved TV since I was a child. And I think when I think about it, I go, oh, maybe that's why I work in television, because I loved it when I was a kid. I had memorized the TV guide, all that kind of stuff. So before cable came along and after that streaming, and before we had 1,000 channels, we really had 3 channels or 2 channels, depending on where you lived, maybe 4 at the most. And television was called broadcast. That's what it was. And what a broadcast is you're making programming that is appealing to the broadest audience all in one package, you
Hmm.
know.
And it's a
And I,
one-way street. I just
yeah,
want to say it is we put it out, you take it in.
that's right. And their audience, many times their feedback audience was really the advertisers, you know. So any disruption in what they were doing is more tied to the advertisers. They didn't like content or that type of thing. That's where television really started. And the shifts started happening really in the early 70s, where CBS said, you know what? We don't really care about that broad thing. We we want to make television a little more meaningful, you know. We want to make it a little more urban. I think it was Fred Silverman who first did that. And he took off hugely successful shows. You know, Gomer Pyle, I think was one of them. Beverly Hillbillies, like that type of what people call, rural comedies. And he put on things like All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore Show. These are more what people call the smart, urbane type of comedies. But it started a wave also of more. of a certain style of progressive content, I think, in television in particular, that was considered elite.
And I
So,
like that you made the distinction between rural
yes,
comedy and urban urbane, right? Because I
yes,
do think so much of this red state, blue state reframing now has
yeah,
to do with location and place and framing
Ge-
as much as
yes.
values.
Geography is a huge part of it. You're absolutely right, which is kind of an interesting thing, you know. And here's how it was kind of how it evolved. So, and this is how people's perceptions of it are. Witty, urbane, citified, progressive equals awards, equals prestige, equals like bigger dollars. Advertisers, you're going after a certain type. Rural, working class, that not considered as prestige anymore. Those shows stopped getting awards attention by and large, you know, and this has happened over the years. Something that I noticed, this this kind of separation of the types of comedies. One of the shows that was kind of interesting that was in the middle of that, it was done by a buddy of mine, Phil Rosenthal. You're familiar with this show, Everybody Loves Raymond. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Everybody Loves Raymond was kind of an old school show, kind of in the Dick Van Dyke realm. But, you know, it's basically a working class family, really. You know, there's nothing elitist about it in terms of its storylines. And he faced a lot of headwinds where people saying it wasn't hip and this type of thing. And it was interesting. It took a while for that show to get attention because it wasn't in the hip club. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying, this is a long way to say we're now coming full circle where there's been a cultural pushback against what has been considered elite shows on television. Okay. And people want something different. The audience is saying, I want to watch something different, you know? And so because numbers don't lie and because how people show up to something is what counts. I always say the most important color in Hollywood is green, right?
Fair.
Right. And, you know, the audience is just shifting in what is important to them. What's important in the zeitgeist, not just what's important to the people making it or what they think is prestige. What does the audience actually think? What do they want to see?
Who defines the zeitgeist?
Right.
That's a huge part of
Exactly.
this.
Right.
So you've said so many things, I don't know where to start. But one,
Okay,
let's
I
go
said
back
it's going to be a
No,
bit
no.
academic.
No, but this is what I love. So when I think about the period you're talking about, let's say 70s, right?
Mhm.
You have Good Times, and then what was the one where they lived in the high-rise building with
That was
Lenny
the
Kravitz's
Jeffersons.
mother?
That's the
The Jeffersons. That's my frame of reference.
This is our different generations, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm thinking, well, we're moving on up, moving
Yeah, no, moving on up.
Right.
What those comedies had in common is it's coming post civil rights
Yes.
battles. We're now
Right.
in integration, and a
Right.
lot of the conversations are about that clashing of the two, about
Yes.
like Archie Bunker engaging with the world that's coming at him.
Mhm.
And even in the Jeffersons, there are aspects of things he's not ready for, right?
Right.
It's like interracial couple and what? Like
Mhm.
the joke is always that clash. To me, that's even more of an acknowledgement of cultural polarization and like having that conversation on television.
Mhm.
And I wonder sometimes when we go through these cycles of exclusion, that's when we feel more acutely what's going on. So for a while, people start to feel like, let me see, after there's so many comedies about urban life, for whatever that means to you, then it's like, well, wait a second. Too many people are excluded here. Now we need like a string of comedies about white working class families, right? And I grew up with that in the 90s, or just working class families in general. So much of that to me felt like backlash to like the Cosby Show. Like that was too high end, too pristine, too, cover of Ebony magazine. We need something for the rest of us, married with children,
Right.
And so,
By the way,
yeah,
that was a direct response to the Cosby Show. You're absolutely
Exactly.
right. And The Simpsons was a response to both of them.
yeah, that part. And
Mhm.
now that brings me to the money, which we're going to come back to this later for the present. But there were also economic headwinds
Mm.
that force these movements as well.
Mhm.
So when I think of something like the CW, UPN, these upstart networks that were trying to gain ground against the traditional big three, what did they do? They catered to Black audiences.
Mhm.
They catered to brown audiences who were the only ones getting their channels for a while, right? And so you have, yeah, so talk about that. It's like you're making in living color because that's the audience you have access to. And as soon as your audience broadens past that, you're like, that's enough of that. Cancel all these shows. We're now making Gossip Girl. So to me, some of it has to do with where the money is for the people running the networks at any given time.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned, I love when you said, who actually determines the zeitgeist, like who's in charge of that? And it's funny. I have, it's fun. This is the type of person that I am, Audie. I will actually have discussions with my friends about things like the zeitgeist. I mean,
Yes,
that's how
this
nerdy I am
is
about this
no,
stuff.
no. This is who we are. This is who we are.
But all of us in entertainment, we are prisoners of the zeitgeist. That's why shows that we may consider good shows, people may not care about because the zeitgeist is like, eh. Or
Not
you,
may not all the time. That was like the running joke about NBC for the longest time. It was
yeah,
like, oh, great show. No one's watching it. The
yeah,
Wire, amazing. Running jokes
exactly.
about no one watching The Wire. Like there's
Sometimes
always a disconnect.
sometimes they're just out of time.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean, but if you watched it in isolation, you go, oh, that's an excellent show. But at the time, the zeitgeist says, yeah, whatever, we're just not interested in it. And so in the zeitgeist now, the current zeitgeist is there's a MAGA zeitgeist out there. And by MAGA, I don't mean that in a negative political way. I mean, it's people that want to reject a certain culture that they feel has been foisted upon them. Let's say an overabundance of that. And what's refreshing to them is to see content that doesn't cater to that or that doesn't kowtow to it in a way where it seems like it's sucking up to it and it doesn't feel authentic to them. So anytime things connect to people, they're connecting to an authenticity about it. I like to call it a mythology about whatever we agree upon. Like, and once again, I'm getting academic, but like I always feel like content works at its best when everybody agrees that the thing that you're dramatizing is what we agree the culture is.
Mm-hmm.
At any given time, which is why, like when Westerns were big, like the audience agreed with the people making the Westerns that that's the mythology of America. We agree with you on that. When Westerns started losing favor, there was a disagreement about that mythology about America and what the Westerns represented, right? That was being broken up. And you couldn't make those same kind of movies anymore. The agreement wasn't there, which is why when you look at artists like Shakespeare, it's amazing how long his agreements have lasted, right?
Yeah.
Because
we agree that teenagers will fight their parents about their relationships.
Yes.
Hasn't changed.
That teenagers fall in love regardless of what their relationships are. Right,
yeah. Or that political wives, keep an eye on them.
Yeah, exactly. So so there's a different agreement happening in the culture now, right? And so when that agreement starts to shift, that's when we see big moves where shows that maybe didn't have a chance before suddenly break through. And you're like, well, why is that show making it? Because the agreement is kind of changing. People, there's a more of a dividing line in what that agreement is. And the other side of that agreement is getting things through. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because when I look and did some of the research into some of the conservative creators out there who are talking about what they're doing and why, this is the language that they're saying. They're talking about breaking through. They're talking about not being beholden to the old stakeholders. When I look at something like The Hunting Wives, which is a very like soapy Dallas, but more nudity on Netflix, that's a series where the whole point is like a fish out of water, someone from Massachusetts moves to Texas. And the showrunner told the New York Times, I was thinking, how can we make this as explosive as possible, as fish out of water as possible, and highlight the culture war as much as possible? Like it's not hidden, in those moments when they talk about abortions or marriage, their role in marriage. Like that language is there as you said, to connect
It's
to
a
a
very
certain part of the
interesting show.
zeitgeist.
Since
Yeah.
knowing that I was going to talk to you, I hadn't seen the show, but I watched it last night, a couple of
I'm
episodes.
sorry I scandalized you.
No, it's
Was there?
okay.
It's
No.
not safe for work, Larry.
No, by the way, I'm a big fan of different voices. I love it when new voices break through. I'm a huge
Yeah.
fan of that. I'm a champion of it. And I love to see it. Even if I'm not a fan of the show, it doesn't matter. I'm a fan of new voices getting out there because I think it's good for all artists when there's a diversity of voices. That's just my opinion on it. So I was watching that show, and honestly, I couldn't decide whether it was a satire of that.
Right.
Or if it was just giving it to me, right?
Right.
Because the Boston character is like, who are we supposed to identify with in this? Who's the actual protagonist of this thing,
Which is probably why it works.
Yeah, it's good. That's what I mean.
I was reading, I think it was a column in the New York Times where they were talking with a researcher who was saying, liberals, and specifically there's a certain kind of elite who's a cultural omnivore as a point of pride and status. And I found that very interesting because I grew up in the 90s and I thought that was just what dudes did, right? You encounter these guys who are like, have you seen the Japanese import of blah, blah, blah? It's like you were constantly trying to prove that you knew about all the different things in the culture. And I hadn't thought of that as almost, like a coastal pastime. And they also said that while liberal audiences are going to embrace something like Hunting Wives, conservative audiences are far more likely to feel like something is being foisted on them, like something that doesn't really reflect how they connect with the world. They just are like, no, thanks. And I feel like that creates a different dynamic because instead of more creators bursting through, you have studios, I think, they're excluding.
Yeah.
Like they have cut off the spigot to some creators and move towards this thing. And that feels different from being like, this is a wider, basket of things.
Yeah, the whole building becomes a bit elitist, the whole building of who's making the decision. And they get to be a bit in a bubble, and it takes a lot to kind of burst through that. And there's always that thing. So in the 90s, I've always considered myself, like I said, more kind of in the center. I think the 90s, I was more center right than center left,
Oh, really?
And
what were you making then? I'm trying to figure out.
Well, I made...
were you in?
I did shows like In Living Color, Sister, things like that. But when I did the PJs, I remember putting in certain jokes that were more center-right jokes than center-left jokes. And they would always get a pushback. And I found it fascinating, the pushback. And I'll give you an example. So we had a character named Juicy. He was he was a big kid, and we were deciding what shirts the kids were wearing. And we were going to give Juicy a shirt that said "Choose Life" on it, And Steve Tompkins, we just loved that idea that you just wouldn't see this on TV at that time, that a kid would have a shirt like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, who cares? Everybody can have
says something about the character. That's part of it's storytelling.
Exactly. It's not making a statement about anything. Oh, the only statement it's making is that character found that T-shirt interesting, And the pushback, I'll never forget the pushback from so many people. Like if it had been a different message that was more on the left, no one would have cared, But the fact that it was on the right was all this pushback from it. And I went, wow, that's fascinating. That I remember just clocking that in my brain of the headwinds. Like if I truly was, trying to do content, like overall content from that point of view, the headwind you have to go in to try to do that at that time, especially was pretty strong,
That speaks to something we're hearing from the Hollywood creators who feel really emboldened by this moment.
Mm-hmm.
I was noting that the Daily Wire, which is conservative
Binge
online
Pro.
outlet, they've got the Daily Wire Plus, and they're making programming.
They should.
I think the highest ranking
I agree with that.
Documentary last year came from them.
Yeah, that's great. I think that stuff is great. They should be doing that because there's an audience that feels like they're not getting the content that they want to see. And so because they can't do that content through the normal gatekeepers in the way that they'd like to, because they need to do it from their point of view, not filtered by this other point of view. That's the problem. I think it's great. Good for the Daily Wire and some of these other places. And like I said, I don't say that saying necessarily I watch all their shows or watch that stuff. I say it because yes, give me more voices out there. It gives creators more of a chance to do something new and to break more molds and that type of thing. So
And the means of distribution with streaming. I
yeah,
mean, just the fact that we're talking about Daily Wire Plus was sort of unimaginable 5 or
yeah,
10 years ago. I think they only came about in 2015 as
that's
an
crazy.
entity.
Yeah.
But the one of the leaders at that studio, he talked about he said he's coming from the Andrew Breitbart School of Politics is downstream from culture,
Mhm.
which I've heard across the spectrum from a lot of people. But he mentions he's like talking about how they all got together, and he said at the time I was running Friends of Abe, which was an open secret group of around
Yeah.
2,800 Hollywood conservatives.
Yeah.
Did you know about the? Did you know about this?
I was invited to a couple of those meetings. I never went because I didn't really consider myself a conservative, but
But was there a secret handshake, or
no, it was a secret. It was the
tell
secret
me
group.
more, Larry? You got to tell me more. What happened? How does that work?
It was a secret because many people in Hollywood felt like they would be blackballed if people knew they were conservative. So they, I don't know how secret it was, but
Were they right?
I think I don't know if blackball is the right term, but I think maybe get treated differently. Who knows? But I had a lot of compassion for it because it felt like to me, why are people being picked on just for being on a different side of the aisle? And like I said, I knew what that was because I was more on that side of the aisle, during a certain period. So I was curious to see what was going on there. I think I'm not outing anybody by saying this, but I think people like Gary Sinise, I think, was in that group, and he's been able to have a career kind of being on the right, but he's not politically on the right. The content that he makes, like a lot of it is patriotism, it's war stuff, things like that. Or you can see the content that he makes is more from what you would call more of a traditional conservative bag of more
and now it's
old
pushed
school.
even a little bit farther, not with him, but just the idea like Sound of Freedom, right, which is a film that just did so well, is very much through the lens of the QAnon conspiracy ideas. And so is it about protecting children? Yes, but is it also very clear it's connected to this like very sort of well-known online political community? You know what I mean? It's not generic.
Yeah. So Audie, so now we're in another wild, wild west. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So we were in a wild, wild west 100 years ago in the beginning of film, where anybody could just, start their own phone company, put it up, and that type of thing. And then people started consolidating companies, and then you started getting big places like MGM and all these things, and they pushed out a lot of these little places. So that's where the gatekeepers kind of started in media. But now with social media and all this stuff, now you can have these, as we said, anybody putting out content. So before, something like a QAnon thing would never get through the gatekeepers, probably for the right reasons in that case.
Yeah.
But there's so many niche audiences and niche groups and ways to reach them through different platforms. There's just so much out there that can be done like that now,
And promoted on its own and marketed through its own organic marketing.
That's right. Influencers are more powerful. An influencer's platform is bigger than the Tonight Show. It's bigger. That's why, when Colbert went away, many times those types of shows were used as platforms for promotion. That was the biggest use of those shows, by the way. Mm-hmm. Like you booked actors according to when their movies were coming out. That's how the booking works.
Yeah, that's actually the only way they talk to you half the time is like, are they promoting something? Yeah.
Yeah. Audie, you have a book coming out. Now you're on Colbert. Now you're on, whatever. That's how bookings work, right? But influencers now have millions of people that they reach. And if those late night shows are in the hundreds of thousands now, not in the millions, that's a problem. Like that's an upside down thing. So, but who are these influencers, right? Like who's their audience? So that's a whole wild, wild west that we're in now.
And it's interesting watching the people who were the traditional gatekeepers reckon with that, right? Right. So from the start, Disney spent all its time fighting with DeSantis, You have a huge movement of people saying, go woke, go broke. And next thing you know, they're like, I don't think we need a trans character in this animated film. Let's pull back from that. You know what I mean? Like decisions, especially as I see people, the tide recede from the awakening, the tsunami of awakening that was that time. As they pull back from that, they're saying things, they're very direct in saying, we no longer want to message to people. Right? They're looking at all of this content they were putting out, let's say in the 5 years prior during the woke period. And they're not saying they regret it all the way, but they're clearly saying, like, you know, we went too far. We pushed too much on people. And that's the part actually that bothers me a little bit, because I think it also was the golden age of television in that there was more of it, right? Like there was so much content out there that I actually thought there was more room for people, right? You could have all different kinds of shows, and why not have that door open? And instead, people seem to be like, oh, that was way too much. We didn't want to see all that. And that feels unnecessarily exclusive, or you know what, punitive.
Right. Well, because some of those audiences have more power now. They have more direct power with social media. You know, I mean, the way people get canceled and everything, and shows get, you know, enough negative publicity instantly. You know, I think studios have to pay attention to those and how they.
But like, could Abbott Elementary be greenlit now? That's not political at all. But I'm not sure anyone would say yes to a school in Philadelphia and a mostly brown cast.
Most good shows get on in spite of the culture instead of because of. Just, this is a rule that people don't realize. Abbott Elementary probably doesn't get greenlit in any era, you know, because it's just hard to put on a show like that. Those shows sneak through. Trust me on this, you know, and they have usually one or two champions that help get a show like that through. But it's hard to get shows like that through in any era for many different reasons. And many different shows that are different, they're kind of lucky to squeak through, you know. This is what I call this the windshield versus rear view phenomenon. Okay, so when you're a network executive, you want to buy shows based on what's worked before. You're looking in the rearview mirror. You know, that's worked. I want to repeat that. And if you're a business person, that makes sense. Something works, do more of that, right? That doesn't sound crazy. But as a creator, you're looking through the windshield. You're looking, what hasn't been done? What are we coming up to in the culture? So you're forward thinking. That's a conflict, you know. So shows that are new and break the mold, they sneak through, Audie. We're lucky. Thank our lucky star shows like The Sopranos even get on the air. You know,
yeah,
it's so rare. So it's a fluke that they get on in any different era. Shows that are different that crack the mold and that sort of thing. All in the Family, another one. Lucky. The timing, just lucky. Could have never seen the light of day. You know, a lot of it was just. You know, same thing, Mary Tyler Moore, another breakthrough show.
Okay, well, thanks for helping me make sense of this.
My pleasure.
Just as a fan, you know, it's always great to hear your thoughts on these things because you're such a student of the history. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Always great talking to you, Annie.